There is a question that no one inside the Watchtower is allowed to ask out loud, not in kingdom halls, not in elder meetings, not even in the quiet conversations that PMOs have learned to have only with people they completely trust. If Ray Franz was completely wrong, if crisis of conscience was nothing more than the bitter complaint of a disloyal man, then why does the organization he described in 1983 keep changing in the exact directions he said it needed to change? That is not rhetorical. And the fact that it cannot be asked inside the organization, that asking it is itself treated as apostasy, tells you something important about how confident the Watchtower actually is in its own answer. In the 4 decades since Franz was expelled, the Watchtower has made significant changes to its doctrine, to the language it uses to describe governing body authority, to its public position on its own fallibility. When you set those changes side by side with the specific criticisms Franz made in Crisis of Conscience, the comparison is uncomfortable, not for him, for the organization. Is the modern Watchtower slowly admitting Ray Franz was right? Subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get into it. The claim against him. You already know how the organization frames him: disloyal, apostate, spiritual poison. The word apostate is not an argument. It is a stop sign, a command to disengage before the criticism can be evaluated. You do not need to refute something if you can make reading it feel spiritually dangerous. What Franz actually wrote was a carefully documented account of what he witnessed inside the governing body. The debates, the votes, the human uncertainty behind decisions presented to millions as divine direction. Named names, cited dates, specific, verifiable detail that is very difficult to fabricate and very hard to refute without engaging it directly. He was not an embittered outsider. He was not a disfellowshipped elder with a personal grievance. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life inside the organization, who had risen to the highest level of its leadership, and who sat in the room where decisions affecting 8 million people were made. When he described what he saw, he was describing it from the inside. The Watchtower's answer was prohibition, not refutation. 40 years of institutional silence on the substance of what he wrote. But silence is not refutation. And the changes since 1983 have made that silence louder. Issue 1. Doctrinal certainty. Franz's first criticism was the gap between the certainty the Watchtower used to present its doctrines and the actual confidence that existed behind them. He was in the room. He described the uncertainty among governing body members themselves. Uncertainty never communicated to the membership expected to act on those conclusions. 1975. The publications, the lives disrupted, the people who didn't have children, sold houses, declined medical treatment. And when the year passed, the organizational response was that members had perhaps read too much into the publications, while the leaders who generated those publications quietly moved on. Franz's point was not simply that the prediction failed. His point was the structural problem underneath, an organization presenting conclusions with divine authority not justified by the actual process behind them, with no honest mechanism for accountability when those conclusions proved wrong. New light is not accountability. It is a theological device for converting institutional error into institutional virtue. The brighter the path grows, the more the stumbles become proof of the journey rather than evidence of a problem. And crucially, the members who reorganized their lives around those failed predictions never received an apology. They received a reframe. Look at where the organization stands today. The overlapping generations teaching, introduced in 2010, revised again since, is one of the most strained positions the Watchtower has ever held. A generation with a fixed meaning now encompasses overlapping groups whose combined lifespan can extend indefinitely. The theological architecture has become so elastic, it can no longer make a falsifiable prediction. The vocabulary says everything: adjusted understanding, refinement, clarification. The confident tone of earlier eras replaced by something more hedged, more careful, more aware of its own potential to be wrong again. Franz said the organization presented human uncertainty as divine certainty, then used new light to manage the fallout. What does 40 years of continuous doctrinal adjustment look like to you? What does it say about the certainty with which those original positions were declared, and the cost paid by the people who organized their lives around them? The organization has never answered that question. It has simply kept adjusting. Issue 2. Governing body authority. This is where the gap between what Franz described and what the organization now openly admits has become almost impossible to ignore. Franz wrote that governing body decisions were made by vote, not by revelation, by a show of hands, where minority positions were simply overruled. When Crisis of Conscience was published, that description was treated as one of the most damaging things in the book. If the decisions came from votes, not from God, what exactly was the organization asking 8 million people to submit to? Think about the blood doctrine. People died. And the policy that told them to refuse the treatment that could have saved them was arrived at by a show of hands. Now consider what the Watchtower says today. In official publications, in broadcasts on jw.org, stated directly by the members themselves, "We are not inspired. We are not prophets. We can make mistakes." Anthony Morris III said it. Jeffrey Jackson said it before the Australian Royal Commission, under oath, where claiming divine authority would have had immediate legal consequences. Stop and register what is actually happening there. Ray Franz wrote in 1983 that the governing body was not operating through divine revelation. The organization expelled him for it. 40 years later, the governing body is saying it themselves. Not inspired, not infallible, capable of error. They are not using his name. They would never use his name, but they are describing, in their own words, exactly what he described in his. The substance of what got him expelled is now part of the official organizational script. That is not a coincidence. That is an admission. It does not carry his name. But in every way that matters theologically, the governing body has confirmed the central claim of Crisis of Conscience, that the authority they wield is human, not divine. And the contradiction Franz found unsustainable in 1980 has not been resolved. It has been restated. We can be wrong. And also, follow our direction regardless. The same demand for unconditional obedience, dressed in the language of admitted fallibility. Franz identified that contradiction 45 years ago. The organization has now confirmed both halves of it, while never acknowledging he was the one who named it first. And that refusal, to acknowledge the source while adopting the substance, is itself a kind of answer to the title of this video. Issue 3. Organizational Control. The third criticism was about what the organization's approach to discipline actually cost the people living inside it. Franz did not describe shunning as a side effect of a well-intentioned policy. He described it as a structural feature, a system designed so that the cost of dissent was high enough to prevent most people from acting on their doubts. You already know he is right. Many of you are living it right now. His own disfellowshipping is one of the most instructive details in the story. He was not expelled for writing Crisis of Conscience. The immediate cause was sharing a meal with a man who had already been disfellowshipped. He ate food with a friend. That act was judged sufficient grounds for expulsion from an organization he had served his entire adult life. Not doctrinal error, not betrayal of confidential information, a shared meal. Think about what that means for anyone inside the organization who has doubts. If the threshold for expulsion can be that low, if eating lunch with the wrong person is enough, then the message to every PIMO, every person quietly questioning, is clear. The cost of any visible association with doubt is everything. That is not a side effect. That is the architecture of control. The shunning practice has not softened since. The governing body has defended it in recent broadcasts with a directness that removed all ambiguity. The subordination of family to organizational loyalty is not a side effect. It is the point. But the world outside has changed. In 2022, Norway's Supreme Court ruled that the shunning practice violated the human rights of former members. The Norwegian government suspended public funding to the organization. Legal challenges have followed across Europe. In multiple countries, government inquiries have examined the organization's handling of child sexual abuse cases. Accountability the Watchtower has spent years managing, denying, and litigating. The questions being asked today by courts and parliamentary committees are, in their essential structure, the questions Ray Franz was asking in 1983. He asked them as a matter of conscience. The world is now asking them as a matter of law. The Watchtower's silence is its own answer. Crisis of Conscience has been in print for more than 40 years. The 2022 edition entered bestseller lists, a book that was supposed to disappear, reappearing 4 decades later to a new generation of readers. Cited in legal proceedings, referenced by journalists, studied by scholars of high-control organizations around the world. The organization has never published a substantive rebuttal. Think carefully about what that means. The Watchtower has the institutional resources, the legal teams, the theological departments, and the documented records to mount a comprehensive response to every specific claim Franz made. They have the governing body meeting minutes he referenced. They have participants from those sessions who could have gone on record. If his account was fabricated, if the votes he described did not happen, if the uncertainty he described did not exist, they could have demonstrated that at any point in the last 40 years. They chose not to, consistently, deliberately, for 4 decades. When an organization has the means to refute a specific claim and declines to for 40 consecutive years, that silence is a form of confirmation. Not the kind they would ever acknowledge, but the kind that anyone paying attention cannot help but notice. There is something else worth naming here. The strategy of prohibition, label him apostate, ban the book, treat any engagement as spiritual danger, was designed for a world where information could be controlled. That world ended with the internet. Every year that passes without a rebuttal is another year. A new generation of doubters can find crisis of conscience in 5 minutes and read exactly what the organization spent 40 years insisting they must never read. Prohibition is not refutation. 40 years of silence on the substance of a book is not the behavior of an organization confident the book is wrong. It is, whether they would ever admit it or not, the most honest response they have managed to give. The final question. So here we are. The organization has adjusted its doctrinal language. It has admitted governing body fallibility. It has watched its shunning and abuse policies become the subject of legal proceedings across multiple countries. And it has continued, through all of it, to prohibit the book that mapped those problems 40 years before the lawyers arrived. Was Ray Franz really the problem? Or was he simply the person inside the organization honest enough and positioned closely enough to see what the problems actually were, and willing to write it down at a cost most people in his position would not have been willing to pay? He lost his position. He lost his community. His name became a warning. Decades of relationships ended because people were required to treat his proximity as a spiritual danger. In exchange for all of that, he got to tell the truth as he understood it. And the fact that the world has continued, in the years since his death, to arrive at versions of the same conclusions he drew, through legal proceedings, government inquiries, the testimony of tens of thousands of people he never met, is evidence that the problems he identified were real, and that they were not going to go away because the organization preferred not to address them. The Watchtower's official account of Ray Franz has not changed. It will not change. He was a disloyal apostate who tried to damage God's organization. That account is not offered for examination. It is simply asserted, and members are expected to accept it as the starting and ending point of any conversation about the man. But official accounts exist in relationship with evidence, and the evidence keeps accumulating. History will not produce a formal vindication. The Watchtower certainly will not. But the longer the organization changes in the directions Franz identified, the harder it becomes to explain why, if his arguments were so easily dismissed, the organization has spent 40 years declining to dismiss them. The harder it becomes to pretend crisis of conscience was just a bitter man's complaint. And the harder it becomes to ignore that the warnings he issued in 1983 are still arriving, wearing different names, in different courtrooms, in different countries, one after another. Some things do not go away simply because you forbid them.